Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
But it's my great pleasure to introduce John Houghton today. So John is very distinguished, and you can read his CV, or at least a brief summary of his CV, which is still quite long, in one of the handouts. So I won't repeat all that, except to say I'm really pleased that he's here with us tonight, because he's a very busy man, not least collecting Nobel Prizes just last month or so. Or I think it was 1/46th share of the Nobel Prize, he tells me, or something like that. 1/25th, sorry, I didn't want to do you down. The reason being that Sir John was in charge of one of the main scientific working groups of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, for a number of years. A very distinguished group which has been a hallmark really of how to do science collaboratively. It's involved, maybe you'll be talking more about it, but it's involved scientists from essentially all the nations of the world coming to a consensus about a global issue of climate change, which is really important. And I think that's almost unique, isn't it, in the world? And it's a great marker for how to do these things over a period of years. And so the Nobel Prize was shared with Al Gore and other leaders of the IPCC, and very well deserved too. You might think it's strange that you get a Nobel Peace Prize for doing science like that, but I think it's actually a very good point that shortage of water, shortage of land to live on that global climate change might cause could actually lead to wars in the future. So actually doing something about it could prevent wars in the future. So anyway, it's a great pleasure to have Sir John, and he's going to talk about big science, big God.
Foundation Institute is doing a marvellous job in not only trying to bring people together to learn about science and faith and how they relate to each other one way or another. And it's very, very important in our modern world that we don't dissect our lives into material and spiritual, into science and non-science. It's very important. We are integrated people. It's often thought that science and religion are in opposition. And putting science and faith together may seem a bit like an oxymoron to you. But my strong belief is that they are actually in a strong embrace. They're mutually enriching, and that we really need to take notice of both and work them into each other. And I'll try and explain some of that tonight. First of all, I've been a scientist all my life. I wanted to be a scientist right from the start. When I was a little boy, I can remember being very fascinated by scientific things. I eventually got into the science of the atmosphere, physics of the atmosphere. I went to Oxford, did a doctorate there, measuring things from aeroplanes, which was great fun. Then in 1957, the first Sputnik went on, 50 years ago last year, which was a remarkable thing, and it gave us a vision immediately, some of us. Here we have the Earth spinning on its axis. Here we have a satellite going around 14 times a day, observing what's beneath it, if you care to put instruments on to observe it. And we thought, what a revolution this could be to the whole science of meteorology, looking at the Earth and its atmosphere. Instead of looking at little bits, which all we could see before really, you could actually see how the whole thing worked together as a globe, as a circulation. And it began this revolution in meteorology, which came with the space observations. And the other important technology which enabled it to happen was, of course, computers, which enable you to analyse lots of data, and also were big enough that you could make models of the whole of this big dynamical system and try to predict what would happen in the future. So it was in the 70s, I suppose, late 70s, you began to get weather forecasts coming to you by courtesy of a computer instead of by human beings. And it was after that also about that time that we began to model the climate. And began to learn about climate change, which I spent a lot of my life on. But in the 70s I was building instruments for NASA satellites, and that again was enormous fun, and also it was very stimulating to be part of this enormous scientific revolution that was taking place in the subject in which I happened to find myself working. Another triumph of the science over the last 50 years has been the way in which the physics of the very big and the physics of the very small have come together in the description of the universe as we know it. If you go up in scale from human size, you go up to 10 to the 25 meters to the edges of the universe, 25 orders of magnitude. You go down in size from human scale, you go down 16 orders of magnitude. It's 41 orders of magnitude in total. And if you look at that website, you can find that illustrated in a dynamic way. You might think, that you would have no connection whatever between things of that very big size and things of that very little size. We just can't imagine that variation in scale. And yet it's bringing those two things together which has enabled the universe as we know it to be described. So, astronomers believe and cosmologists believe that the Big Bang started it all off about 14 billion years ago. I just want to mention a few things about the universe. I'm not going to give you a cosmological story. It would take too long. I have other things to talk about too. But I want to try and give you some feeling for the universe in which we live. And I want to talk about size, energy, and position. First of all, a bit about size. Let's begin with the solar system and its 8 planets. Pluto no longer being a planet of an official kind. If we had made a scale model of the solar system so that it would fit roughly in this room, then the sun would be a size of a pea, small pea, in the middle of the room. The Earth and the other planets would be specks of dust in the rest of the room, distributed amongst the rest of the room. The nearest star would be in London. Our galaxy, which is there with the Milky Way, it's a disk, would extend to beyond the Moon's orbit. On this scale, about 100,000 kilometres away. A galaxy which contains 100 billion stars, 100,000 million stars in our galaxy. We move away from our galaxy to other galaxies, and that takes us, there's a picture that takes you to much further away, to 2,000 million light years away. There are a cluster of galaxies in that part of the universe. This is a picture from the Hubble Space Telescope. You'll see some smudges on the diagram here. These smudges are images of even more distant galaxies, the light from which has come by these galaxies and got distorted or focused, and so you see them as smudges. There are about 1 billion galaxies in the universe, and the farthest ones away, of course, are about 10 billion light years away or more. That's the size of the universe. Energy. We're familiar with volcanoes and earthquakes thunderstorms, they're minuscule compared to things we find out there. Very minuscule, of course, compared with the Big Bang. But there are lots of very energetic things going on there. As the universe began to expand from the Big Bang, largely hydrogen, as atoms came together, hydrogen and some helium. Parts of this great cloud of gas, this gassy cloud, was of higher density and condensed to form stars by the force of gravity. Now, stars shine because of the nuclear energy that is being burnt in them. As hydrogen nuclei become helium nuclei, a lot of energy is released and mass is lost. But not just, it doesn't stop with helium, of course, it works all the way. As various nuclei get together, and you find nuclei being synthesized, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and all the way up the periodic table to iron, within the stars, that are in that were being formed in the universe. Eventually, some of the stars run out of energy and cool. Others, as they grow old, explode. There's the Cloud Nebulae, which was first observed by the Chinese on the 4th of July, 1054. I don't know whether the 4th of July should be a special day because of that, for other reasons. That was an exploding star, a supernovae. And when supernovae explode, when those explosions occur, and there've been about one a year, is also something like that, I think, is seen in the universe somewhere by astronomers. When that occurs, in that explosion, other nuclear processes occur too. So that working all the way up the periodic table, we've got to iron. If you want the heavier elements, they were made in these sort of supernovae explosions. And then you get a big dust cloud as a result of that. And within that dust cloud, the process begins again. Regions of higher density condense back into stars through the force of gravity, and second generation stars appear. And our Earth, or our Sun rather, is a second generation star. And made out of this debris, and also other background hydrogen and helium that was there in the universe. And so our Earth was a planet circling the Sun. And our planet contains all the 92 stable elements we know. And you needed all that whole universe and all those processes for that to occur. Very remarkable story. Well, that was energy. Let's go on to precision. A Big Bang sounds a very unprecise event. It sounds like a thing that just goes bang and has no structure to it and can't be controlled. But the Big Bang was extraordinarily precise. It had to be, to provide the universe as we know it. Martin Rees, who's the president of the Royal Society at the moment, has written a book called 6 Numbers. Numbers which were controlling that process at the beginning of the universe. And the force pushing it all out, the force of gravity which was pulling it all back, had to be balanced to 1 part in 10 to the 60. Now if you have a combination lock with 4 dials, then you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of hitting on the number that will open the lock. What's 10 to the 60? If you want to shoot at a target somewhere in the universe with the required precision, you'd be able to hit something a millimetre square at the edge of the universe. That's the sort of precision with which those forces were balanced. And if you think that's a big number, try this one. Roger Penrose. Sir Roger Penrose, mathematician at Oxford, distinguished mathematician who's worked on cosmology and also very fundamental mathematics concerned with the laws of physics, quantum mechanics. He's studied the Big Bang, and he's considered the entropy which would be possessed right at the beginning. Now, entropy is disorder. We know about the entropy of the universe now, to some degree. We work back to the beginning and work out what the entropy must have been in order for the universe to be so ordered in the way it is ordered now. And the number he comes up with, that the initial order had to be specified to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the 100 to the power of 123. Now that is a ridiculously large number. I've now just written down 10 to the 123 there. I can't write down 10 to the power of 10 to the 123. Because if I cut all the trees down on Earth and turned all those trees into paper, and wrote zeros on all that paper, I would have nothing like enough zeros to describe that number. If I could take every atom in the universe and write a zero on that atom, I would have nothing like enough zeros to describe that number. That is the precision with which the universe began, or at the Big Bang. And I take that picture from Penrose's book. He's not a particularly religious person, but he has a picture of God with a pin, picking out from all the possible orders at the beginning and the phase space of possible universes to that precision. Now that's a remarkable story, the story of the universe. I tried to tell you very briefly, to give you some idea of our present understanding of it. And of course there's another story too, which I'm not competent to tell you about, which is the story of life on Earth with all its richness and variety. This intelligence, therefore, behind the universe. When you think about some of these remarkable things, you put them together, we're not proving anything, we're just providing perspective on what we know about the universe. Is there a creator there, or is there intelligence behind it? And one of the questions we're bound to ask is, where do the laws of nature come from? The laws of nature which describe the science which I'm doing. Where do these feelings of awe and wonder come from? Albert Einstein described himself as a deeply religious non-believer. He was prepared to talk about God. He was prepared to think about an intelligence behind the universe. He had no great difficulty with that. But it wasn't a personal God. You may know of this book, even if you haven't been so stupid as to try to read it. But you will find, if you read it, that Richard Dawkins actually accepts the possibility of an Einsteinian God, an intelligence behind the universe. He doesn't at all want to use the word God for this intelligence, because the word God actually makes him sick. But he's prepared to accept that. But then, of course, he goes on to argue that science has disproved God. he believes, which is a bit of a non-argument, because science can't disprove God any more than science can prove God. Science is not the job of science to tell you whether God is there or not. That is a question to which science is bound to be agnostic. But science does have to accept, of course, that there are laws of nature which are outside science. And even Dawkins doesn't dispute that, although he tries to bring them inside science by some jiggery pokery, which I don't follow, and I don't suppose he follows very much either. You see, science is not the only story, because science is only asking how questions. Science doesn't ask why questions. Science asks questions how things work and how they fit together. It's incredible how the remarkably mathematical basis of science has been built up. And that's some of the how of science. But it doesn't answer why questions, but more of that a bit later. So I want to firmly try to present to you tonight a very simple view that if God is creator, if we believe in a creator, then the science we do is by definition God's science. And if it's God's science, then this is part of the embrace that I began with talking about. I've never had any difficulty as a scientist or as a Christian in accepting that the two are very close together. And I won't tell you anything else tonight, or you don't remember anything else tonight. Please remember that phrase, that science is God's science, by definition, if God is creator. I mentioned one threat to that statement, which comes from atheism, of course. There's another threat which comes from the intelligent design movement. Let me just say a bit about that, because that's a big worry, I think, to some of us. The proponents of ideas, it's called, and there are not so many in this country, but there are quite a lot in the United States. And they come from a reaction to the Dawkins, people like Dawkins in this world, who are saying that there is no God and that evolution has explained it all. There's no need to bring God into it at all. They react against that and try to bring God in another way. They argue that there are areas of science, especially concerned with the evolution of living systems, where the degree of complexity is such that explanation on the basis of scientific law is impossible. They call them areas of irreducible complexity. They argue therefore that these areas must have been intelligently designed by a supernatural agent. Now, the first and most obvious problem with this idea is that as scientific knowledge expands, so does scientific understanding. Things that seem impossible to understand today may eventually come within the ambit of normal scientific description. This is happening all the time. So if we find something we don't understand and we label it as divine intervention or direct divine action, so plugging our knowledge, then when a scientific description comes along, then the gap in our knowledge has gone away, and so has the supposed divine action, and the God of the gaps is bound to diminish as science advances. Well, that's not an old problem, it's a problem that was present in the days of the early experimental scientists, of course, the time of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton had that problem a bit. Of course, he said the force of gravity is fine, I've got that from, that's in my scientific description. But the Earth spinning on its axis, I can't imagine how that occurred. So that must have required a divine arm to set it going. He was plugging that gap we've got. So the problem with the idea approach, which is even more fundamental, is that it's based on a misconception of the nature of scientific laws. They're not created by scientists. They describe God's ordinary activity. So the whole of creation is God's intelligent design. Both the bits that science can't explain, or has no description for, and the bits that science can explain or can describe. Both of those are God's activity. Both of those belong to him. Both of those are part of the creation. They're both dependent on God's laws, which are his laws, and not invented by scientists. And I believe that Christians need to take the high ground and not the low ground in this business, and insist that God is the creator, if we're going to have a creator, and insist that he's in charge of the whole show, and he's the great intelligent designer. In fact, the whole universe is God's fantastic intelligent design. So what is God like? Is he a deist God? In other words, he's made it all. He started it all off. He lit the blue touch paper, and he's perhaps gone away and doesn't take much notice of it anymore. A God who's the creator, who made it all, but getting any further contact with him is not possible. That's a possible description, and there are lots of scientists who accept that description quite happily. God is the great designer. Dawkins has a big problem with that, and he argues strongly against a God of that kind, because he says, well, who made God? The great designer. Who made the great designer? You may have heard the story of the lady who was present at a talk, I think, by Stephen Hawking years ago. And she got up and said, well, the Earth lies on top of a big turtle. And what does the turtle lie on? Oh, another big turtle. In fact, it's turtles all the way down. This infinite regress of who made who all the way up. And that's not a stupid thing, of course, to bring up if you're trying to get rid of God. I was listening on my internet the other night to the part of the debate between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox, which took place in the United States recently, and which you can find on the web. I didn't get time to listen to it all, but I did come across the bit where he was actually, John Lennox was replying to Dawkins on that issue. And he said, well, of course that doesn't make any sense to the Christian, because the Christian says, who made God? The answer to that is nobody made God, because he's always been there. So the question is a non-question. Now, that's an interesting answer, and it has some mileage in it possibly, but not very convincing to the likes of Dawkins. I think a much bigger answer than that is to say, well, what sort of God do we know about? Has God anything else connected to him than the creation? And if God is not just the creator, but is someone who has lots of other things about him that we can learn about in our faith, and we become convinced about in our faith, then there is a strong reason for saying God is the creator and has not been created himself and has always been there and so on, because you've got a much bigger thing to think about. Because you can have some relation to him of some kind. And in particular, if he's a personal God, then that makes a great deal of difference. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but Dawkins in his book, as I remember, if I've read it correctly, he has one sentence in the book that says there is no evidence for a personal God, full stop. He doesn't analyse that question, he doesn't discuss it in any form. I believe it's very foreign to him, the idea of a personal God, and he says a personal God just does not exist. And if you're a Christian, of course, the person of God is absolutely crucial, because he is the God we worship. He is the God we get to know. There's a marvellous sentence written by C.S. Lewis, which puts that argument in a quite a clever way. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And it's the everything else that provides the argument, as well as the fact of the creation for God. And we're not left with a God who we have to believe as a creator and nothing else, because that really doesn't mean very much at all. That sort of God doesn't matter very much. Is there anything in science which might connect the intelligence behind the universe with the creation? Let's ask that question. I'd like to say three things about that. I've already covered this to some extent. Was the universe made with humans in mind? A lot of cosmologists ask this question. Cosmologists who are not religious people particularly, or Christians in particular, well, they ask the question, was the universe made with humans in mind? Now, for human life to be possible, as I've already tried to explain, the universe has to be extremely large, extremely old, and incredibly fine-tuned. Otherwise, the Earth and its life could not be here. So the whole universe was the workshop, it could be argued, for making human beings. There may be other creatures there too, of course. We've no reason particularly to say we have a unique part in the universe. Nevertheless, for us to be here, we need the whole of that universe, and the whole of that 40 million years when it's been going, in order for us to be here. And that's really very humbling, and very striking, very remarkable fact. Not that it proves anything. It does give you perspective. The second thing is something Einstein said. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's incomprehensible. And that is, again, cosmologists are absolutely amazed by that. A man like Roger Penrose is absolutely amazed by the wonder of the mathematics which lies behind the forces of nature, that lies behind the whole structure of the nucleus of the atom, and lies behind what happened at the Big Bang. Very remarkable. But why is that the case? Because you might say, well, it doesn't seem to have a lot of survival value. It doesn't make us, the fact that we can understand the universe hasn't helped us to survive on Earth in an evolutionary sense. So it's remarkable. And the third point, which might help us to give, again, some perspective on this connection between the intelligence and the creation, is the mind of God. Stephen Hawking, in this remarkable book, he sold well over 10 million in hardback. If I sell even one very small fraction of that, I think I'm doing pretty well. And he finishes in his closing paragraph. He looks forward to the discovery of a complete theory of the universe, which would enable a more complete discussion of of why we and the universe exist. If we find the answer to that, he says, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason. But then we would know the mind of God. His closing phrase. Has God got a mind? Is it like our mind? What do we mean by the mind of God? Paul Davies writes one of his books, which he calls The Mind of God, taken from the last phrase of Hawking's book. He writes as follows. He says, I cannot believe that our existence in this universe is an incidental blip in the great cosmic drama. Our involvement is too intimate. The physical species may count for nothing, but the existence of mind in some organism on some planet of the universe is a fact of fundamental significance. Through conscious beings, the universe has generated self-awareness. This can be no trivial detail, no minor byproduct of mindless, purposeless forces. We're truly meant to be here. And Paul Davies is he got the Templeton Prize for his work in cosmology. He's a religious person, but he's not a Christian person. He's absolutely fascinated by the mind of God and that idea. Now we have minds, very remarkably. It's possibly the biggest challenge facing modern science, to try to understand what we mean by a mind, what we mean by consciousness, what we mean by self-awareness, what we mean by freedom of action. And science hasn't moved very far with that. We don't even have a definition of consciousness that is satisfactory. We don't even know, we don't even have a test which we can put forward for testing whether if you have a box in a room and you either have a computer or a person inside, and you can communicate with that box, obviously through a keyboard or something. How do you decide whether it's a person or whether it's a computer? There is no test of that kind, as yet. So mind is an interesting phenomenon, scientifically, and but we all have them. Very important part of us, our minds. The fact that we have mind and personality, that's Paul Davies' comment. The fact that we have mind and personality implies that God must have personality. If God's made us and He's the creator, then we can't have some valuable property that He doesn't possess. At least I would argue that. And humans, we're told, were made in God's image. And I'm not trying to make God in our image by making that argument. I'm just saying that we've got to think of God in very big terms, the biggest terms we can. And you can't imagine a God who's can have any relation to us unless he possesses his personality. So where have we got to? Our scientific exploration has led us to the need or the wish to do religious exploration, which is what I've been trying to do in front of them. It was William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1930s, who said natural theology ends with hunger for that divine revelation, which it began by excluding from its purview. Natural theology is the study of how God is related to his creation and what we can find out about God by studying the creation. And indeed, let me leave you with this thought, that I might be able to know God, the creator of the universe, personally, is the most fantastic thing that could ever happen to any of us. And that must be true, whether you believe that God is there or not. At least it's worth exploring. I want to move on a bit and try to explore briefly the nature of God and his relation to the universe. I want to do that by introducing you to another Roger Penrose book called The Road to Reality, which is a remarkable scientific text. I think it's about 800 pages long, and he goes through the mathematical expression of the laws of physics in terms of geometry, in terms of algebra, classical physics and quantum mechanics in those 800 pages. If I tried to read it properly and learn from it properly, it would take me a year or two. I haven't done that, but it's a very remarkable book. It's not for the weak-minded to tackle it. So why do I bring it here? Let me show you one of Penrose's diagrams, which he has in his first chapter and he comes back to in his last chapter, which I think are rather remarkable diagrams. He's trying to lay out before you the whole of the galaxy. And he depicts this in three worlds, which he also describes as three mysteries, because he acknowledges the awe and the mystery of the whole process of why we're here. He has this world of physicality, as he calls it, which is the material physical world, which is where we do our physical science, and which is the things we touch and can see and can handle and all those sorts of things. And he describes, and that's where the science is done. When you go up to the top sphere, you will find a sphere of truth, a world of truth. And that's where the laws of nature lie. He calls that absolute truth. This is apart from the physical world, because it's outside our science, it's outside the physical world. It is the world of truth. And then he has the sphere of mentality. That's our minds, our thinking processes, all that goes on within our brains from the mental point of view. That's the third sphere. Now I'll leave morality and beauty out just for a moment, because he adds those later on. There are arrows in that diagram. There's an arrow going from truth, absolute truth, where the laws of nature are, to the world of physicality, because it's the science there is controlled. It comes from these laws, which are in the sphere of truth. Then the world of mentality is dependent, of course, on our brains, on the physical thing called the brain. Without the brain, we don't have a mind, so it's dependent on the physicality. Then he has another arrow there, which links mentality and truth. Not quite sure. He's not quite sure how to draw that one, as he explains. He adds into his diagram not just truth in terms of laws of physics and things like that. He also adds beauty and morality, in that he's following Plato's world. Plato, his world of ideal forms. And he believes that those are linked in some way to the mentality world down below. And he wonders whether the world of morality actually somehow originates with the world of mentality, or our mental processes. But he's not sure about that. And then he adds beauty, because this is one of the great qualities that we know and love, and which is in that absolute world at the top. I thought that was a very interesting diagram. Penrose is not a Christian, not a believer in God particularly. He's not a disbeliever either, I think. He's prepared to accept the intelligence behind the universe idea. I've had some correspondence with him because I asked his permission to use his diagrams and to show them around in this way. I fiddled with it a bit and I added to that diagram believe that the top sphere is describing something that belongs to God, the Creator. It's describing Him and His character. And therefore I allowed my computer to paint it gold. I also added a golden arrow that goes from the top sphere to the mentality sphere, because I believe that our mental, our minds, are also dependent on those absolute things that belong to God. In some way dependent on God's mind. Although I don't know how to expand that as either theologically or philosophically, because I'm neither a theologian nor a philosopher. But that's how I would like to draw that diagram. I'd like to present it to you, for you to really think about it. And think about the nature of God in terms of the things we know about. And I think the wonderful thing about it is that it does put together the whole of reality in this form that makes you really think about it. I now want to change tack a bit, and I want to try and just use an illustration of how we can use a scientific model, sort of scientific model, to describe where God is. Something that's been very helpful to me, and I hope it will be helpful to you too. If we go to, we have space-time, 3 dimensions of space, north, south, east, west, up and down, and we have a dimensional time. And those dimensions go together very elegantly in Einstein's theory of relativity. In fact, the statement, time is the 4th dimension, and that time has a dimension like space, it's a very good description of his special theory of relativity. That's the basic idea. Einstein didn't express it that way to begin with, but when you express it that way, that's actually what it's doing. You make time look like space by multiplying it by the velocity of light, the square root of -1. When you do that, physics is revolutionized. So as if you were asked a physicist, why do you believe in the theory of relativity? He'd be hard put to give you one answer. He'd say, well, the whole of physics depends on it. Very wonderful, remarkable, simple idea. And I'd like to present to you the idea that we might think about God in another dimension, the 5th dimension, if you like, the spiritual dimension. And how can we work that through? Well, in the 1880s, there was a man called Edwin Abbott, who was a mathematician, who wrote a book called Flatland. And this was it was not a religious book, it was not a scientific book particularly, but he was a mathematician, and he thought he'd think about a world which was flat. So there were just 2 dimensions in his world, 2 dimensions of space. And his world was inhabited by beings that were mathematical figures. There were straight lines, there were triangles, there were squares, there were pentagons, hexagons, all the way up to circles. And he really wrote it as a satire on class, so that your class in Flatland depended on the number of sides you possessed. The top class of Flatland were the circles, because they had the greatest number of sides, and they were the priests of Flatland. The lowest people in Flatland were the straight lines, because they only had straight lines, 2 dimensions, 1 dimension, what can we call it? 1 side, 2 sides. And they were the women in Flatland. But remember, he was a Victorian mathematician. And he imagined how these people got on the houses they lived in, and the houses on the whole were effectively. And some of the people were squares, some of the people were triangles, and his wife, of course, was a straight line. And he described in detail how these creatures manoeuvred in their flat space and avoided each other, got to know who each other was and what they did. A fascinating sort of exposition from this mathematician. But then the punchline comes near the end of the book, and he imagines a sphere coming in from spaceland, as he calls it, and he imagines a sphere coming towards flatland from space. And this sphere begins to go into flatland and becomes a circle in flatland, a small circle and then a bigger circle, and then like that, and then goes out the other side. And the sphere does that a number of times and tries to explain to the flatlanders the time of sphere. And they just can't understand it at all because they have no knowledge of any other dimension. Everything is flat. There is no such thing as up and down in their world. They cannot conceive of it occurring. But eventually the desperate sphere picks up a flatlander and takes the flatlander outside the plane of flatland and flies over flatland with this creature and points out the insides of the houses, the insides of the beings. You can see their innards from outside. And then, which of course amazes the flatlander, he dumps him back on flatland. And then this creature tries to explain to his fellow flatlanders what it's like to get in the other dimension. Fails completely. They think he's gone bonkers and they put him in jail. That's the flatland book. We have the same problem as the flatlanders. We live in a world, 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. We can't imagine anything other than is in our 4-dimensional space-time world. Imagine that God is in the spiritual dimension as a model. He's outside the material universe, and yet able to see and know all about it. In other words, he's transcendent with respect to it. He's also can be within the material universe. And in particular, we believe as Christians that he came in to our universe in the person of Jesus. He's immanent and transcendent. He's also in some sense outside time, because time is part of his material creation. Very hard to think about being outside time. The nearest human description of that I found comes from Mozart. He said that when he composed something, he didn't see it as a sequence. He saw it as a whole. When he composed a piece of music, he said it's like looking at a painting, beautiful painting. I see it all at once. And therefore Manning has to write it down in a sequence. Remarkable, actually. And there are mathematicians, of course, who sometimes get flashes of inspiration, which are outside time in a sense, because they see the solution to a problem without going through all the elements of the solution, but they see the solution as a whole. I don't know if this helps or not, but it's interesting to sort of wonder what it's like to be outside time. And God is in some sense outside time, but also in some sense within time, which is part of the model. And then, if we have if you imagine a 2-dimensional world, which is flat and like a piece of paper, that's my 2-dimensional world. Compare that with a 3-dimensional thing, it's solid. much more solid by adding the other dimension. If we have a 5-dimensional world, much more solid than a 4-dimensional world. Adding the spiritual dimension makes it more solid. That's a serious thing to think about as well. This is only an analogy, of course. I remember years ago when I talked about this to a student audience, one chap got so taken up with the idea, he started to ask me about the conservation of energy in this 5-dimensional world as well. Take it to that sort of extent. You may say, well, perhaps we shouldn't be thinking about God in this way because aren't we trying to put God in a box? I don't believe we are. We're trying to use some of the structure and the things we know about in our science or our time and space and say, how can we think about God? It's not a new model, of course, because there's you go to Isaiah, you find thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place. I am outside the universe, but also with him who is a contrite and humble spirit. Transcendence and immanence was not unknown to the Jews of the Old Testament. It certainly isn't unknown to us as Christians. But I find it a very helpful way in trying to think about where God is and how he relates to the universe. How does Jesus fit into this? Just a word about that, because when we go to the Old Testament, we find in Proverbs, we find wisdom being described, a personalised wisdom, being described as the divine architect. Wisdom, I was the craftsman at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. Proverbs chapter 8. A description of God making the universe through personified wisdom. In the New Testament, we find personified wisdom equals Jesus. Paul talked about Jesus being the wisdom of God. In John chapter 1, you have the words, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were made by him. So Jesus was the agent of creation. The agent of this spiritual dimension was Jesus. Then if we go to the Gospel stories, of course, we find that Jesus rose from the dead into a transformed body. I've done that one. And he had this body which could go through closed doors and appear somewhere else. Just like a spear outside flatland could travel from place to place without actually going through the taking its way through the flatland. Jesus' body had a new dimension with it that enabled him to travel outside our normal space-time. So how does God act in our world? Can we think about that in any way which involves this dimension? I tried to draw it there in the way space and time is the at the bottom, and then the spiritual dimension is the vertical dimension there. And there is a line of progression through that 5-dimensional world. Or rather, maybe through the 4-dimensional world, but with influence of the from the spiritual dimension. There's somebody playing. Our prayers are said to a God who is in another dimension. And we hope that God will answer those prayers. And God has the means of acting within our world. in different places and at different times. God even sometimes may seem to act in the past as a result of our prayers. That's a difficult concept, but it's a perfectly scriptural one. Before you called, I answered. You may wonder at the end of the day sometimes, I sometimes wonder, there's a particular event, somebody particularly had a particular need I was wanting to pray about and I forgot to do so. Can I, at the end of the day, when that event has passed, can I still pray about it? I think the answer is yes. Providing, of course, you don't actually know the result of that event, because if you know the result, then it's very hard to pray. You can't change something that you already know about, that you know about. So you don't know, you can go to God and say, please do something about that event, because God can actually maneuver in different places, space and time. I just leave you with these thoughts to help you to think about God in another dimension, or think about God really acting in his universe. Let me finish with just reminding you of a couple of things. The reformers, some of the early scientists, were Christians, of course, the days of Newton and Boyle and others, and they often talked about two books. Francis Bacon is supposed to be the origin of this idea, but you've got Psalm 19 in the Old Testament and it's there. You'll find the two books there, the book of God's Word and the book of God's Works. And we need to put those two books together. What we're trying to do in this winter school you've come to is to put those two books together. They fit together. By definition they fit together because God is the author of both, of his word and of his works. And when you look at both of those at the same time, it's like having binocular vision. Going back to the dimension idea again, you add a dimension to your view. If you just look with one eye, you get no sense of depth. So if you just look at God's word but ignore his works, you have a limited view. If you look at God's works and don't ignore his word, you have a limited view. Put the two together and you've got depth of a kind that you cannot get in any other way. Seeing. The analogy of seeing the truth is the most important one. And putting lots of things together is the way in which you get an integrated view and the truth becomes a whole. And that's a remarkable thing. A quote from a schoolboy essay. The difference between science and religion is that science is material and religion is immaterial. Now that is might have a double meaning, but it's not true anyway. Because both are both. You cannot divide the science into the material. And the science is material and religion is the non-material, because it doesn't work that way. They two overlap. They embrace each other. And we need to recognise that our faith is a wonderful thing, because it enables us to embrace both the material and the spiritual. And because I'm so absorbed with the business of climate change and caring for the earth, I was bound to give you some message of that kind. And there's a picture of the earth, the moon, where it looks quite fragile. But it is a fragile earth. And we're raping it at the moment. When I was a younger scientist, I used to think there was nothing you could throw at the atmosphere that would make much difference. Now I know differently. We're throwing lots of things at it when we are making an enormous difference to our Earth, much of which is not very good. So there's an enormous scientific and spiritual challenge in doing that. Bob remarked about the Nobel Prize for Peace, which I went to Oslo to help to collect with Al Gore. He got one too. From the IPCC got one. When a scientific body gets the Nobel Peace Prize, that says something about science. The way science has moved on, as you suggested, Bob. So we have a big job to do as scientists and as Christians. And that's, if you want to read a bit more about it, or read in another form, some of what I've said tonight, you'll find it in our briefing paper on the John Way Initiative website, which is there, JRI.UK. You can download it and you can print it out, or you can, there might even be some for sale on the bookstore here, so you could save yourself the ink and the paper by paying a little money for it. And I called it Big Science, Big God, because I think it's a big story. And there's also, I have a book which has just been reprinted by the John Way Initiative because it was out of print. So we've arranged to have it reprinted, and some of those are available too, which you could buy on the bookstore. And I like to finish with the Celtic cross, because there's the cross of Jesus surrounded by the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sir John. That is a splendid introduction to the topic of this weekend. So here's an opportunity to ask anything that's come up on this topic. So who would like to start? Let's start at the front and then move back.
Thank you. You speak of dimensions, and there are the two dimensions you offer of word and work or works, as in the psalm. What about a dimension to add to that of revelation in prayer, which somehow doesn't seem to come directly from either the word or the observation of creation?
Well, that's an interesting idea. It's, you think you have revelation that comes to you apart from the revelation of God in Scripture, in Jesus, with all that that means. Or apart from anything you find in creation, that's true. But I would, in the sort of analogy I built, I would just build that into the spiritual dimension, I think. That God can speak to us in all sorts of ways. He often speaks through His Word, He speaks through His works, but He can also speak to us directly into our minds. And but we have to be careful about the recognition that that form, because we might be kidding ourselves that we've got a revelation when we haven't.
I have indeed kidding myself.
Well, I wasn't saying it always, it's bound to be that kind, but there are, but we're told in Scripture that we should test the spirits or our connections by what we find in the Word. But I'm not ruling that sort of thing out at all. It's a nice idea, interesting idea. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I was very interested to see that you finished with the Celtic cross. The reason is I've just returned from Iona,
Yes.
and within their community they're very much involved with thinking about the planet and trying to do what they can. They've also become one of the first, if not the first island in Scotland where they're now totally fair trade for all the things themselves.
Yeah.
How do you see that we might be able to bring that into the wider community, or is it possible to bring that into the wider community?
Bringing what into it?
Where we think more about the planet and possibly help people to think about recycling, and we do have a responsibility for our planet.
We have an enormous responsibility to bring information, good information, correct information, accurate information into the community about these environmental issues in particular, of course, the climate change issue, but other issues too. And there is a lot of misinformation around, which makes it hard, of course, harder to get the real information of God. But when Christians have an enormous responsibility to play their part in taking a lead, actually, in helping the world on its way, a reluctant world. A world that's reluctant to take action because they think it's going to do them down in some way or other. And we're all very greedy people. And we have to, as Christians, we've got to try and take leadership action of a kind which I believe was a fairly radical kind, and I can talk more about that, and then leave it there at the moment.
Thank you.
Lots more, let's start.
So John, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. Just again going back to the cross, it's kind of just intrigued by the circle actually around the cross. It reminds me of the ancient symbol of Ouroboros, which is recently cosmologists are thinking about this big and the small coming to a point of nothingness to something, and kind of think with the origin of is that kind of coincides with each other? What's your thoughts about it, about the origin and the cross and the circle? I mean, in other scriptures it describes as a whole and the wholeness. And is it that something that's kind of is also been described here as well, or as the origin of the thing?
Well, I'm not an expert on the origin of that cross, because there are symbols a bit like that have been used by groups, pre-Christian groups, I think, to some degree. And but it was used in the, and I happen to live in Wales, a Celtic part of the world, and I know that through the Welsh, some of the early pioneers, people like David and Patrick of Ireland, used the Celtic cross as a symbol, and no doubt they did in Scotland too. But I can't tell you much more about its origin, I'm afraid, but it appeals to me because of there's a symbolism there of the cross of Jesus as the Redeemer of the world, and the world is there because God so loved the world. And I think that's a very wonderful expression of what God has done for us.
You talked about the level of precision for the universe to be the way it is. So what do you think about the idea of parallel universes? To give us an explanation of that?
Yes, that's a way of avoiding the precision, because you say that we could be just happen to be in a universe that fits being here, and there are billions and billions and billions of universes out there that don't fit. Well, we have no knowledge of those. It seems a rather extravagant thing to say that there are all these universes out there we know nothing about, and we just happen to be in a random one that happens to be ours. If you want to believe that, then I have no way of disproving it or suggesting that it's you know, there's something in science that goes for the simple answers rather than the complicated ones. And parallel multi-universes seems a very complicated idea, and doesn't fit in with the simplicity that you'd expect to have this answer. But these are just thoughts really from outside science rather than inside science. Other people might have some comment on that too.
Yeah, perhaps I can just interject that we had a public lecture last term by Professor George Ellis, who used to be president of the Royal Society of South Africa, and knows a lot about multiverses, and it was a lecture on the multiverse, and he made the comment there very similar to what you've just said, that he thought multiverses were invented to avoid the theistic implication of this universe. But I should also say, as a little advert, you can download the entire lecture in MP3 from our website. If you go to multimedia, you can listen to it for yourselves. Encourage you to do that.
It would be a good lecture.
It was a very good lecture, yeah. And I think he drew out some of the, I suppose, the weaknesses of the multiverse hypothesis, even from a scientific point of view. So it is a metaphysical point of view, that's all. I think you have questions.
I just wanted to ask, I might have missed this or possibly being a bit simplistic, but with your big science, big God, I seem to have got from your lecture that this is necessarily a big Christian God. Or is this some other God, or different gods all pointing to the same?
Well, I've talked about the God I know, because I'm a Christian. Now, if you want to, and then therefore, some of the way that I describe it has been from a Christian point of view, and from using Christian pictures and images and stories and so on. The idea of Jesus also coming into it. So I've done it from a Christian point of view. Now, because I don't know enough about other religions. I know a bit about the Jewish religion because, of course, of its Christian roots. I think that the Old Testament God is there too, quite clearly in the sort of imagery I've used. I don't know enough about other religions to know how they would fit in, and therefore I can't really comment on how they would react to the sort of picture I presented. And if you have that sort of knowledge, I'd be interested to know how it hit you from a different religious point of view.
I think, I'm in a similar position to you. I just wonder if this is an answer of sort to how science and religion can be combined. How you get away from the fact that you could conceive of religion or God as a human construct, in which case any religion has a valid claim, and of course we're in a predominantly Christian country, so we will argue that God and Jesus are that answer, but...
Well, I've tried very hard to avoid any implication that my God is, or the God I've described, is of a human construct. Because a God who's of a human construct is not a God worth knowing. Because it's an idol of a kind that has no, that's not real. So I've been trying to talk about a real God who's revealed himself in various ways. He's revealed himself in his creation, and I've tried to explain that as well as I can, using, of course, the picture of a Christian God, because I'm a Christian. He's also revealed himself, I believe, in the scriptures, and in the person of Jesus in particular. And I've emphasized the idea that I believe God is a person, because he must be a person if he's there at all. And he's a person you can get to know. And that becomes very personal, of course. Very personal to anybody who is trying to think about this. And that relationship is between you and God, which is the relationship I'm trying to talk about. Now that relationship is therefore very special. And it's something that everybody has to think about. And say, well, is this God that I'm talking about, does this ring any bells within your mind, or within your experience, or within the sort of perspective that you get from other things in life? Does this fit in? Not that you're inventing it as a God you want to worship and therefore I will fall down before it because I've made it, but it's something that's outside you. The whole idea of the God we're talking about is a God who's not part of our minds or made up by our minds, but is a body someone with personal qualities, who's the creator of the whole thing, who's out there. And that's the relationship I'm trying to build up in your minds as well as my own.
Could I refer back to your Penrose diagram with three
Yes.
circles?
Yes.
And I think you said he had some difficulty in relating the mentality circle to the one at the top. Was that right?
He says very little in the book, actually, the Penrose diagram. To bring it up on the screen, was that?
Well, if you like, as I understand it, scientific experiments have shown that mind, in some sense, exists over and above the purely physical actions of what goes on in the brain. Now, he didn't seem to recognise that in his diagrams, and I wondered if he had done, whether it might have helped him to see the relationship, or perhaps he does in his book.
I don't think there's not a dualism. Penrose is not suggesting a dualism between mind and the brain, and the physical and mental.
No, he wasn't recognizing.
But he's saying, he's linking the mental with the physical, because there's that very strong link. But there is also a link between the mind and this absolute area where the laws of nature are, and those things of truth and beauty and morality. Now, and he doesn't know how to do that, and he explains that he has difficulty with that arrow or that part of the diagram. But he only describes it in 2 or 3 sentences, so there's not a great deal there to get hold of. But so I've read into it a bit, perhaps more than I should, I don't know. But I've also tried to think about it from a religious perspective. It's saying, well, if this really belongs to God, then there is a relationship, and then, as a Christian, as a believer in God, I believe there is a strong connection between, because if you're going to have a personal relationship with your Creator, then your mind is involved. And the flow of the information must come to you rather than the other way. Now, so that's why I put that golden arrow in. Now, that's for debate, of course, exactly how that happens. And there are people, scientists, who study our mental processes is working in a way that creates a morality. Does it come from the evolution of the mind? Now, that's a perfectly proper thing for scientists to try to study. But they haven't got very far with it. And how far they'll ever get, I don't know. But there are people like Dawkins, I'm sure, would say morality is a construct of the human mind. But that's very hard to defend against, the problems of evil and so on in the world that we face and the like, which have to do with morality. And I'm not an expert on that, so
Yes, I wonder if I could take you back to intelligent design that you mentioned earlier, and that some mechanisms in the world seem incredibly hard to explain how they might have evolved. The analogy that someone quoted to me was that of the mousetrap, which only works if you've got all the bits and doesn't work partially if you've only got some of the bits, which I found quite helpful. And I suppose what puzzled me about some of the debates in recent times in the United States was that on the one hand, some Christians seem to have a vested interest in saying there can't be an explanation, and some non-believers seem to have a vested interest in saying there must be an explanation. And I wondered if you could say something helpful about how we live with doubt in circumstances where, frankly, we don't know.
Well, I think the easiest way to resolve them is to say we don't know. Saying I don't know is a very proper and important scientific statement. I would also suggest it's also a very proper and important theological statement. And some scientists and many theologians are very reluctant to say I don't know, when I don't know is exactly the proper thing they should say. So I don't know if that resolves it in any way. Perhaps it chops it off, but I don't know whether Dennis would agree.
No, I guess we'll be coming back to ID tomorrow as well, tomorrow afternoon.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's very helpful for scientists to say they don't know, because one of the perceptions in this world is that scientists are arrogant and know everything. That is perhaps one of the weaknesses of Richard Dawkins' book as well.
So, I would like to treat the idea of soul in our picture, the idea of soul in the picture that you have got.
That is so.
The idea of soul in the idea of God. What would you like to treat?
Well, soul is a description of some part of the human personality. Is that right? How would you define the soul?
That's a very typical Hindu idea that
Yes.
there is something inside which cannot be put into words. That something is into the idea of God, is a God.
Well,
Inner something.
well, it's a word that's often used about in order to hide off the bit of us that relates to God. Is that right?
Some higher dimension.
And so you could perhaps try to fit it into the sort of scheme I described, but I wouldn't want to do it off the cuff.
I think it's true to say that the Christian view, at least, would be that you can't be a soul without a body. We're embodied people with material people, so in that sense you can't separate
Yeah, sure.
two bits and have them existing separately. I think that's fundamental to the Christian religion, which is different from other religions, but feeds through into the new creation as well. Will be embodied people there in the Christian view.
Although Descartes was a Christian, wouldn't have agreed with you.
Yeah.
So there's been some arguments within Christianity.
Yeah,
Yes, and
It's
these
a very-
arguments still go on, of course, yes.
a very Platonic view, though, isn't it? It comes from Greek thinking.